dame i gospodo, dobrodošli na drugu sesiju foruma Mediji u Srbiji u digitalnom dobu. Pozdravljam vas ispred organizatora ovog skupa, izdavačkog preduzeća Clio i udruženja Biblioteka Plus. Zadatak ove današnje sesije je da domaćoj javnosti približimo pojam medijske pismenosti, ali i da ukažemo na njega različite aspekte u kontekstu digitalizacije medija. U tome će nam danas, pored vas, pomoći i naši sagovornici, Endi Radok, profesor Naučnog univerziteta Monaš i autor knjige Mladi i mediji, i naši panelisti, Milena Đurićević-Šešić, profesorka Univerziteta umetnosti, Aleksandar Luj-Todorović, profesor istog fakulteta, Ana Martinoli, predavač na Fakultetu dramskih umetnosti, zatim Dalibor Petrović, profesor Fakulteta organizacionih nauka, saobraćajnog i filozofskog fakulteta, i Đorđe Krivokapić, predavač na Fakultetu organizacionih umetnosti i predstavnik šer fondacije. Ovom prilikom zahvalila bih se i misiji OEPS u Srbiji i Ministarstvu kulture i informisanja na podršci prilikom organizovanja ovog skupa. Pre nego što prepustimo reč našim sagovornicima, pozdravit će vas i Gordana Janković ispred misije OEPS-a u Srbiji i Zoran Hamović ispred izdavačke kuće Clio i udruženja Biblioteka Plus.
Profesor Radok, dragi učesnici, gosti, dame i gospodo, drago nam je da smo danas na ovom skupu sa vama. Skup posvećen medijskoj pismenosti je važan i za mandat misije OEPS-a u Srbiji, zato što promoviše i kritičko mišljenje i važan je za činjenicu da se time ostvaruju ključna građanska prava. Bez poznavanja medija u digitalnom dobu, građani ne mogu ravnopravno da učestvuju u radnoj oblasti društvenog života, niti da reaguju na odgovarajući način kada su u pitanju njihova privatnost, bezbednost i etika u digitalnom okruženju. Veliki tehnološki napredak je doveo do ponovnog promišljanja građanskog učešća u javnom životu. Zato je online prostor postao ključno važan svima, i deci, i mladima, i odraslima, ženama, muškarcima. Misija OEPS-a se zalaže za medijsku informacijnu pismenost svih građana. UNESCO je kroz svoju Parisku deklaraciju iz 2014. reaktualizovao pitanje medijske i informativne pismenosti u digitalnom dobu. Medijska i informativna ili informacijna pismenost i tehnološka znanja su komplementarni. Jedno ne može da zameni drugo. Važno je da tehnologija je dostupna građanima, ali je još važnije šta će oni izabrati da rade sa njom i kako će reagovati na informacije, medije, tehnologiju u želji da učestvuju, da potvrde svoje identitete, razmene različita kulturna iskustva i budu etični. Ne radi se samo o tome da je tehnologija prisutna i ima sve veći uticaj na društveni razvoj, obrazovanje i ekonomiju u Srbiji, već i o tome da su građanima u svetu prezasićenima medijskim porukama sa novim etičkim izazovima neophodne veštine čitanja ili kreiranja medijskog sadržaja u svim oblastima života, zato što građanin sada postaje učesnik kompletnog procesa. Sposobnost da se uspešno koriste informacije i medije u različitim kontekstima uključuje čitav niz veština za koje je potrebno više vrsta novih pismenosti u digitalnom dobu. Znanja ne samo o mogućnostima, već i o rizicima i izazovima koje ovo doba nosi. Zahvaljujem se našem gostu, profesoru Radoku, koji je pre 4 dana došao iz Australije na pomoć i širenju znanja o medijima i jednoj novoj perspektivi koju je doneo. Profesor je imao vrlo intenzivnu nedelju, obilazeći studente u Novom Sadu, Nišu i Novom Pazaru, razgovarajući i sa njima i sa novinarima, sa građanima. I sada će nas kroz svoje predavanje u Beogradu inspirisati za dalji rad i dalje promišljanja u ovoj oblasti. Posebno se zahvaljujem organizaciji Biblioteka Plus i izdavačkoj kući Clio, sa kojima sarađujemo već nekoliko godina kroz projekte digitalne i medijske pismenosti, zato što su prepoznali važnost medijske literature za obrazovanje u digitalnom dobu. I više od toga. Oni ne samo da objavljuju važne naslove, već i dovode autore, omogućavajući nam tako dragocenu razmenu ideja i iskustava. Klio je jedan od retkih aktera iz privatnog sektora koji je prepoznao važnost ove oblasti. Već pomenuta Pariska deklaracija ohrabruje pristup višestruknog partnerstva i promovisanje medijske informacijne pismenosti, pozivajući sve učesnike poput novinara i medija, biblioteka, audiovizualnih tela, obrazovnih institucija i privatnog sektora da rade zajedno. Posebno mi je drago što je ovde ministar pogrešno. Nažalost, ministarstvo se nije pojavilo na ovom skupu, iako je bilo pozvano, tako da mi je žao što ministarstvo nije prisutno. Kako Ministarstvo telekomunikacija, kulture i informisanja, tako i Ministarstvo obrazovanja, ali se nadamo da će u perspektivi sva ova ministarstva prepoznati značaj ove teme i nastaviti da sarađuju na što širem frontu kako bi se dostupno znanje iz ove oblasti učinila jednostavnijom na nivou svih. Mi sarađujemo sa Ministarstvom telekomunikacije i oni rade intenzivno na formiranju nove infrastrukture u obrazovnim institucijama osnovnoškolskog nivoa, da bi se ono što postoji kao mogućnost obrazovanja u drugim zemljama regiona dovelo i u Srbiju. Znači, novi planovi, novi načini sagledavanja će doći kasnije kada se ta infrastruktura učini dostupnom do kraja ove godine. Drago mi je da ovde vidim danas mnoge stručnjake za obrazovanje, kao i mlade, s obzirom da je školska učionica jedna od retkih mesta na kojima se još uvek prednosti digitalnog okruženja ne koriste dovoljno. U tom smislu širenje medijske informacijne pismenosti je od ključne važnosti, jer medijska pismenost nije samo cilj, ona je i katalizator inovacije u obrazovanju, komunikacijama, kulturi, ali i u politici. Misija OEBS-a u Srbiji ostaje spremna da pomogne i medijima i inicijativama u medijskom digitalnom obrazovanju da što bolje odgovore na izazov promena koje donosi tehnologija. Ja bih iskoristila bezobrazno ovu mogućnost da vas pozovem na još jedan skup gde će jedna od tema koje su vezane za medijsku pismenost, to je tema reality show i regulacije ove oblasti biti dostupna javnosti i kroz debatu koja će se održati 19. u 10 sati u UNS-ovom centru, gde ćemo takođe imati kolege iz Britanije koji će doneti neke svoje iskustva i gde će regulatorno telo za elektronske medije dati na neki način svoju viziju regulisanja ove oblasti. Hvala vam što sam ovde i srećan rad.
Hvala, gospođo Janković. Gospodin Mihanović, izvolite.
Hvala, pa evo, Gordana je već sve rekla, ne znam sad šta da kažem.
Dobro. Dragi dame i gospodo, uvažene kolege, dragi prijatelji, odista je veliko zadovoljstvo kad imamo priliku da pozdravimo one ljude koji nam donose ne samo inovaciju, nego i priliku da s njima razgovaramo. A kad imamo nekoga ko dolazi iz Australije, što nema često, onda je zadovoljstvo značajno veće i pokazalo se u protekle 4 dana dok smo putovali Srbijom da zaista možemo da svoje iskustvo proverimo, uporedimo sa onim iskustvom koje ima profesor Radok i da stvorimo jednu možda i drugačiju sliku, neki put i u nečemu bolju od onoga kako su imali, a neki put se pomalo i zabrinu. Ne mogu da ne iskažem posebnu zahvalnost OEBS-u i Ministarstvu kulture zato što da zaista nisu videli da je ovo vredan projekat, mi danas ne bismo sedeli ovde i ne bismo mogli da razgovaramo. A smatram ovaj naš današnji susret važan. Ne mislim da je formalno prisustvo nekoga iz bilo kog ministarstva presudno važno. Mnogo je važnije to što je učinjeno u prethodnom periodu. Dakle, stvoreni su neki uslovi, započeta je obimna i ozbiljna aktivnost na stvaranju uslova za razvoj medijske pismenosti u školama. Ona je još uvijek, rekao bih, nedovoljno artikulisana, još uvijek je u nekoj vrsti buđenja, ali to je, kao što reče Gordana Janković, proces i dobro je da u tom procesu aktivno učestvujemo. Da bismo imali čvrste oslonce u tome što nam je namera, dobrodošli su ovakvi susreti u kojima imamo prilike da uporedimo znanja, iskustva i drugih koji dolaze iz drugačijih, ponekad i uređenijih društva nego što je naše. I u tom smislu je ovaj naš projekat, podsjetio bih ga samo, digitalni mediji u Srbiji, svojom prvom sesijom 4. marta, gde smo razgovarali sa Rukom, stvorio onu vrstu uslova da dođemo možda i do najvažnije tačke, a to je razgovor o mladima i medijima. To je najvažnija tema, rekao bih danas. Ali je vrlo zanimljivo da u ovoj predizbornoj kampanji koja se odlikuje prilično snažnim, izrazitim ćutanjem i prihvatanjem jedne stvarnosti koja nam ne odgovara. Neverovatno je da se nigde, ajde o kulturi već da ne govorimo, kultura se vrlo retko spominje, ali se mladi uopšte skoro ne spominju, o medijskoj pismenosti da ne pričam. A to je nesumnjivo jedna od veoma značajnih stvari. I dobro, da se ne ljutimo na ono što jeste, već da menjamo koliko možemo, zato smo danas tu. Rekao bih da je današnje prvo predavanje, a kasnije i panel usmeren na to da medijsku pismenost osvetlimo iz nekoliko perspektiva. Iz one zakonodavne, iz one kulturološke, iz one stvaralačke, iz one koja se tiče ekonomije, dakle, taj deo je takođe važan. Pokušat ćemo iz svih aspekata, i tehnološke, pokušat ćemo iz svih aspekata da osvetlimo ovu temu, a da pritom subjekat budu mladi. Ono sa čim završavam ovaj uvodni deo jeste da mi je neobično drago što je profesor Radok sa nama, budući da je on jedan od onih, rekao bih, digitalnih optimista, koji smatra da je bolje, značajnije učiti od mladih, nego samo davati instrukcije i postaviti se kao neko ko objašnjava mladima šta jesu mediji. Njegovo istraživanje je uvek usmereno na to da istražujući zapravo sarađuje sa mladima, da dobija deo njihovog iskustva, analizira i ponovo na neki način kao predavač im to vraća. A naravno akademskoj zajednici daje doprinos u rezultatima takvih istraživanja. Stoga je važno da vas usmerim na to da ga danas pažljivo saslušate i da ne budete samo pasivni učesnici, da samo slušate, nego i da kasnije u razgovorima aktivno učestvujemo i postavljamo pitanje i u tome budete naravno svi koji ovdje danas jeste. Mi smo tu da to pomogu. Završavam s time što vas podsjećam samo da je izdavačka kuća Knjige u okviru edicije Medija tokom protekle 2 decenije, dakle 20 punih godina se bavi upravo time, medijskom pismenošću, oblikujući tu ediciju sa mnoštvom, velikim brojem knjiga koje upravo daju najznačajnije rezultate, doprinose u ovoj oblasti, a da bismo oživeli to što jeste u knjigama i da ih ne stavljamo samo na police, napravili smo organizaciju koja se zove Biblioteka Plus, čiji zadatak je transfer znanja i stvaranje ovakvih uslova, ovakvih susreta kao što je ovaj danas. Nadam se da ću imati prilike i dalje da se time bavimo i da aktivno učestvujemo u onome što je reforma obrazovanja, makar u ovom malom delu koji se odnosi na medijsku kulturu. Tome ćemo i dalje davati svoj doprinos, upravo zahvaljujući svojim divnim kolegama koji su stručnjaci, profesionalci, koji su u toj oblasti i koji će danas razgovarati sa vama. Hvala vam na pažnju.
Zahvaljujem se organizatorima na pozdravnoj reči. A sada u prvom delu programa očekujem predavanje profesora Endija Radoka na temu šta od mladih učimo o medijskoj pismenosti. Nakon njegovog predavanja predviđeno je vreme za pitanje i komentare iz publike, tako da vas pozivam da se uključite u diskusiju. Također vas podsjećam i da je obezbeđen simultani prevod, pa kome je potreban može se poslužiti slušalicama koje možete pronaći na stolu na ulazu u salu. I također, ukoliko među vama ima oni koji koriste Twitter, pozivam vas da se uključite u diskusiju na toj društvenoj mreži koristeći hashtag medijska pismenost. And now, Professor Radok, please join us.
Thank you, Radoka. Thank you everybody for coming here today. It's been quite an amazing week. I want to thank OSCE and Cleo and my friends that I've made this week who've accompanied me most generously around Serbia. But I also want to begin with an apology to the translators because I'm not going to deliver the paper that I wrote and sent to them 2 weeks ago. And there's a very particular reason for that. I'm going to speak to that paper. But it would be extremely arrogant of me to present a paper today that I wrote 2 weeks ago, having spent a week in Serbia learning about Serbia. Because the title of my paper today is what we learn about media literacy in relation to you. So you'll notice that I'm not talking about what we can teach young people about media literacy. I'm talking about what we can all learn about the social impact of media by thinking about questions of media influence, which are traditionally pursued in relation to young people. And I've learned a lot about this week. I should add that I'm also slightly scared that if I give the same paper again, Zora will attack me or walk out or something. He's had to listen to it 4 times, so please have pity on the poor man. With the greatest of respect to all of my very generous hosts, I would venture to say that the most enjoyable, I would venture to say that the most enjoyable experience academically that I've had this week was speaking in Novi Pazar yesterday to a group of mostly young high school students about questions of media literacy. And it was a very interesting experience in a couple of levels. Of course, one of the main things that we must recognise is that when we're talking about media literacy, we're not really talking about media literacy, we are talking about political literacy. We live in a world where it is not possible to engage politically without understanding how media work and without, on a certain level, being able to use that language. The other thing is that we need to be forensic about our understanding of the word political. I'm speaking about the political as it exists in relation to popular culture. So we're talking about a media literacy that recognises that popular culture is a central part in the formation of a political consciousness. And what I mean by a political consciousness is an understanding of who we are, who other people are, an understanding of how the world works, an understanding of how we relate to one another. So quite often this means with relation to young people, this means getting them to take quite seriously, or in relation to us as well, taking quite seriously things that young people do with media, either in terms of the sorts of things that they enjoy, the sorts of music they listen to, or the sorts of things they do, particularly around social networking. Now, to return to Novi Pazar, as Zora mentioned, I've worked in many parts of the world, and one of the differences I notice is that if you introduce the idea that young people's popular culture is something serious, is something which teaches serious lessons about how the world works, particularly around things like identity and ethnicity and race and class, these sorts of things. It's very difficult in my teaching experience. It's been very difficult to introduce these ideas to American students, very difficult to introduce them to British students, quite difficult to introduce them to Australian students of a European heritage. It's not difficult to introduce those ideas to Chinese students. You introduce that idea to a Chinese student, they go, of course, hello, Cultural Revolution, yes, we kind of figured that one out. But the interesting thing I found in Mladi was this idea, an idea which young people in many other parts of the world, particularly in parts of the world where we think that our media are free, are quite hostile to that idea. To the young people in Mladi, the sense that I got was that made sense to them. That this idea that the sorts of stories that they consume, the sorts of things that they consume for entertainment, actually plays a very important role in the lives that they lead. This made perfect sense to them, and I was very struck by the fact that we had a group of young people who were listening to me speak under very difficult circumstances. I mean, we were having to work for a translator. And I think we had about 20 people in the room. And the one thing I noticed was there was only one of them who spent most of the time messing around on his mobile media. That's a pretty good ratio if you've only got one person doing that. Most of them were listening quite carefully. But of course, the other thing was that it was also a challenging session because a question was asked, and it was an extremely good question, about, okay, but who are you? It wasn't phrased in this way. It was phrased in a very, very friendly way. But the upshot of it was, who are you to come into Serbia and talk about media influence when you don't even understand Serbian media? That's a perfectly relevant question. And we have a huge problem in media research, which is about the Anglo-centered nature of that research, particularly around young people. A lot of the global knowledge that we have about media research is very dominated by knowledge that comes from Anglo systems. So what I want to do today is really kind of speak to what I think are the global conditions. My point is that I've been challenged to really think very carefully about what the global conditions that structure youth media literacy initiatives everywhere. What are the issues that are common, and what are the challenges that we face? So I suppose with regard to that, I'm going to offer a few ideas that I think would be the foundation for a proper understanding of the relationship between young people and media literacy in Serbia. So for example, the young people I talked to yesterday, I think we can say are really at the cutting edge, at the coalface of the role of media today in the generation of political consciousness. They are people, as I understand it, from a particular area of Serbia that is, for example, they're very concerned about the way that area is represented in media and the way that representation can create a set of expectations that affect how they are treated as young people from that part of Serbia. And I have to say there's something in that I recognise from my own research. In my own research that I write about in the book, one of the things that's really important is that most young people kind of understand how media power works. So if we're thinking about issues around misrepresentations of, you kind of have these situations where certain sorts of young people from certain parts of the world who dress in a particular way are thought of as being particularly dangerous. This is something which happens in many other parts of Europe and the United Kingdom too. And young people know about this, but the question is, well, what do they then do with it, and how can we work from this? So, one of the reasons to research young people in the media, I think, is that if you look at all of the research that's been done on young people and the media, and if you understand that research, you pretty much understand the state of international media research, generally speaking. The reason why I wrote this book is I'm not particularly fascinated with young people. To misquote Whitney Houston, I don't believe that children are our future. Or really, what I mean by that is that, you know, I think sometimes we assume that young people are actually inherently more vulnerable to media influence, or inherently more interesting as media users than other people. And I think neither of those things is true. I think that one of the lessons that we learn from international media research is that really good media research depends on the ability to talk about how particular media work for a particular group of people in a particular place and time. So what exactly happens, how exactly do young people in Nobody Bazaar use media, and how would they describe the role that media play in their lives, in their own terms? These are the driving questions, and I think we'll get back to that. But the thing that I am very interested in, the reason why I wrote this book, is I realised that all of the big questions about the political influence of global media systems have, one way or another, been researched in relation to young people. So let's think about the state of that research. And I suppose the first thing we could say is, what do we learn? So what do we learn about media literacy initiatives by looking at young people? Well, the first thing we learn is that the first challenge to media literacy initiatives is that there's a particular way of reading academic research which suggests that there's no real evidence that media do terrible things to young people anyway, and that many young people use media in perfectly creative ways. They understand it better than most scholars do, and therefore we should just kind of leave them alone to their devices. So I want to talk about those two areas of research and where they come from. So the first area of research is, for example, if we look at research that's been done on the effects of media on young people. So if we think about, globally speaking, for example, if one of the things that would be common between Australia and Serbia would be the concern about the impact of social media on radicalisation. So I was recently speaking to the Australian Army on questions of media effects, and there was a counter-terrorism expert who was talking about the role of social media in stoking radicalisation. And he showed an image that had been tweeted from Raqqa by an ISIS fighter. And the image shows a picture of a radicalised young Australian holding a jar of Nutella and pointing to it. Now, I want to come back to this image because I think we can use it to think about different kinds of media influence. Of course, the idea, the concern here is, do images like this help radicalise young people? Do images like this normalise life in Raqqa and increase the chances that a young person is likely to take up arms for the Islamic State? And of course, one of the things that we have to recognise as media scholars is that this sort of question has been around for a long time. So if we go back to the start of media research arguably begins with a group of studies called the Pain Fund Studies, which set out to examine how Hollywood gangster films, amongst other things, corrupted young Americans in the late 1920s and early 1930s. The same sort of question. Can exposure to certain sorts of media messages change behaviours? And immediately, in that particular set of projects, there was a recognition that the relationship between media content and young people is incredibly complex. The Pain Fund studies quickly made the case that to understand the relationship between young people and the media, you need a variety of different kinds of methods. But there's a particular value in looking at two things. Firstly, there's a particular value in looking at the social uses and the social appeals of media technologies to young people. So, for example, the point was quickly made that the idea that Hollywood films are doing things to young people was pretty ridiculous at that time, because most young people in the 1930s went to the cinema to be in the cinema and to be with their friends and to share a social experience. And therefore, most of the time, they weren't even looking at what was on screen. So the idea of media effects was quickly, the idea of that direct media effect was quickly dismissed. So the idea that an image of a young man in Raqqa with a Jal Martella could make someone join ISIS is patently ridiculous, and there's no real evidence that would support that kind of reading. And on the other hand, we also need to understand the social values that the young people find in media. So one of the things that we need to understand is that if we think about current concerns about radicalisation, you can make the case that they're the latest in a long chain of concerns about the power of media to make young people violent. So, in the 1930s we had film, in the 1950s we had comic books, in the 1970s we had television, in the 1980s we had video horror films, and now of course we have video games. And the argument is always the same. The argument is that the evidence, and if we bring things forward to thinking about contemporary debates on the effects of video gaming, for example, there are some scholars, and I'm thinking about the American scholar Brad Bushman, who would argue that a long time diet, a long time playing aggressive video games, violent video games for a long period of time, does produce a significant increase in real-life aggression. Now, there's another scholar called Chris Ferguson, who argues that that research is problematic on a number of levels. First, it overemphasizes the strength of the evidence about the association between exposure to violence and aggression. Secondly, that there's a publication bias in international media research, which makes it easier to publish findings from studies that find a relationship between video gaming and aggression than to publish studies that find no relationship at all. And third, there's a really important political drive behind research which tries to ask if media can make young people aggressive or antisocial. It's easy to get funding for it, so it's easy to fund that kind of research, and it's easy to publish that kind of research because, according to Ferguson, it's politically expedient to do so. It's far easier to blame the social problems that young people face on media than it is on other things like poverty and development and all those sorts of things. Then, of course, there's another important branch of international media studies that would be loosely organised around the term creative industries, which argues that popular culture is our global culture, and that really media studies, particularly critical media studies, is kind of old-fashioned. It has vastly overestimated the power of media industries, and if you look all over the world, you can see young people using media in incredibly creative ways to articulate the ideas that they want to argue. So the problem with many media literacy campaigns is that they assume that media are a problem in young people's lives, when in fact they're a resource, and young people are quite happy with that. So this kind of brings me back to Novi Pazalo, because the young people I spoke to yesterday aren't happy with media. They're not happy with what they see. And there's actually quite a lot of evidence to that effect. So, for example, you talk to gamers, and of course, the first interesting thing is most gamers are not young people, most gamers are adults, but they're not happy either with what they get. They're unhappy with the amount of violence there is in video games. So, on the one hand, we need to acknowledge that the evidence that media can independently do terrible things to young people is controversial. But the other thing is that I think what we need to do is think critically about the notion of creativity. And the idea that I've kind of introduced is that increasingly creativity in today's world means young people become creative by learning to speak and replicate a media language. And this, I think, is the problem that we face in understanding media literacy. It's not that young people don't understand the media. It's not that young people can't create media content. It's just that when they do, it's actually that they understand the media too well. That the young people that we hear about tend to be the young people who are best at replicating the commercial, entertaining media language that is really our kind of lifeblood. There are two examples that I speak to in the book in relation to this, and I want to end up in Raga sort of thinking through these ideas. So there are two examples that I speak to in relation to media violence, and the first is, and I suppose what I'm trying to say is that there's one, I suppose one of the things that I try and argue in the book is that the young people who are most able to, that we hear from in media, are the people who are able to speak a commercial language. And it's by thinking critically about this commercial language that we begin to see that the main effects of media on everybody's life is a limitation on the political imagination. There are two ways, there are two examples, there's a couple of examples that I use in this regard. One is the case study of a young man called Andrew Robinson. Andrew Robinson is a survivor of the 1999 Columbine massacre, a school shooting which of course was not the first school shooting in the United States, was actually not even the most deadly, but is the best known because it was the most widely covered in media. An event which was not only a news story, it was the third most reported news story in the United States in the 1990s, which has also become a part of popular culture. Is a story that's been retold in many popular narrative forms. I'm thinking about things like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, American Horror Story, these sorts of things. So Andrew Robinson actually ends up making his own movie about this. So this is quite an extraordinary story. This is a survivor who is so angry about the fact that he's had to spend a decade watching other people tell his story, that he goes to university, goes to film school, and then makes a movie about Columbine called April Showers, featuring a Hollywood star, Tom Arnold. And on a certain level you think, well, this is an extraordinary story, isn't it? But on another level, if you look at what Andrew Robinson says about this story, there's something quite sad about it, because he could have written a blog about this, he could have done podcasts, he could have done all of these things, but no. He had to make a Hollywood film, and he had to make a Hollywood film that was on a certain level entertaining, so it would attract an audience, so he could repay his investors, so he had to put together to make the film. So the point was that no one's going to listen to me until I present my story in a format that they find familiar, the Hollywood film. Now, this is quite important because I end the book with talking about the way that creative media resources have been used to help child soldiers in parts of the world like Africa and South America. Soldiers, young people who are trying to recover from a traumatic incident, and for whom part of their recovery is the ability to tell their story about their experiences. And in places like Sierra Leone, what we find is that the problem for these young people, very poor young people, isn't getting access to media resources. And it isn't learning to use the media resources. And it isn't in making media content that's quite interesting. It's in finding a market. It's being able to sell and distribute those resources, because they don't speak that same kind of familiar language. The audience isn't going to be entertained and soothed by these stories. They're going to be confronted by them. So again, you have two equally creative sorts of media action, demonstrations of media literacy. We know about one because it speaks a familiar commercial language. We don't know about the other. Now I'm going to finish up quite quickly now. Another example that we talk about in relation to the book, is the role of drinking, the way that young people and social media actually end up helping the alcohol industry by learning the codes of advertising and using those codes to express their pleasure that they find in their own social lives. So what we have quite often are, for example, there's an interesting history, this is UK-based research. There's an interesting history of the alcohol industry in the UK which suggests that alcohol has always advertised itself in the UK by occupying existing cultural traditions. So you've all heard of the Great British Pub, right? You know, an English pub. I'm sure people have heard of that, and maybe some of you, I know going to London is difficult, but some of you who've been to London have been to a traditional English pub. There's nothing traditional about the English pub. The traditional English pub didn't really exist until the early 19th century. It was an invention of the brewery industry who were concerned about the fact they were losing customers to the gin industry. So we've got this long history of alcohol retailers kind of occupying traditions. And we see the same thing around alcohol advertising and young social media users. The way that alcohol advertisers have become very adept at getting around and evading alcohol regulations which prohibit making connections between drinking, fun, sex, all of these sorts of things. And they can get around all of these things by encouraging young drinkers to celebrate the pleasure that they get in drinking venues through social media. So again, you have this situation where young people are creating all kinds of interesting, creative, interesting images to look at, but again, they are speaking a commercial language. Now this brings us back to Raga, I think. This is the interesting thing. So here we even have, a radicalized young man who is bent on destruction of everything that we know about, right? Bent on destruction of everything that we know about, and yet we have the same dynamic. He's communicating using the language of commercial culture. Hey, we got Nutella. Now, the idea that would make anybody change their behaviour is ridiculous, but isn't it kind of interesting that you've actually got incredibly divergent political ideas that on a certain level are all struggling for attention on the same terrain, the terrain of commercial media. So what we need to think about in regards to media literacy are a range of things. Media literacy is about far more than decoding media content, because I'm probably the 2000th person to make this point, but if you do any research on young people in the media, young people can decode, can understand and read the implicit messages of media content all day and all night. So with regard to drinking, the idea that an alcohol advertisement would make them want to drink a product is ridiculous to most young people. But the question that there's some kind of connection between going out to commercial alcohol venues and dancing and drinking and having fun, and that's kind of natural, that's harder to think your way outside of. So what we really need to think about then is the way that commercial media culture and the culture of consumption actually has a political effect on constraining languages that we can use, but also constraining the languages that we use to communicate political ideas. So even a radicalized young man in Raga has to connect up with commercial culture. This speaks to a seismic change in the nature of global culture, the extent to which political change and inclusion is challenged by the overwhelming hegemonic presence of a commercial entertainment media language. Now, does that mean that all media are bad? No, it doesn't. What I'm pointing to is the fact that we begin media research with bearing in mind a particular tension in public culture. And this is that commercial media culture, for all intents and purposes, is global culture, is our common culture. That isn't inherently bad, but there's an inherent tension there, because what it means is our political imaginations are politically reliant on a sort of a storytelling culture that isn't designed to serve those needs. And that's the fundamental tension that we need to pay attention to. So, what do we do about that? I have 3 suggestions, if I can just find them. Firstly, somewhat ironically, we need to be fair to media. We need to start talking about the media. We need to understand variations in media practices and media experiences, and learn to distinguish between different sorts of media that work in different sorts of ways, and also understanding the pressures that media industries work under. So what that means is, an important part of media literacy is not about reading media content, but reading the media, reading the industries that produce that content, understanding how they operate, understanding the differences in how they operate. The second thing we need to do is we need to all become media scholars. We don't just need to be media literate, we need to be media research literate. We need to understand the many different forms in which media power comes, and we need to understand how we can use the evidence that's right in front of us to explore that power. So, for example, one of the examples in the book is a really compelling case, I'm reporting somebody else's research, but about how a small group of young Muslim teenage girls in Palestine use mobile phones to evade patriarchy. It's not saying that's the way that all young Muslim women use mobile phones, but it is kind of saying that this small case study talks about how young people develop strategies for evading certain forms of media power. So learn about where you can find those sorts of compelling case studies in your everyday life. And then the third thing is, write your media biography. If you look at most media scholars, they begin their research from a personal interest. They begin their research from a personal experience. And certainly, when I was sitting down and thinking about writing this book, I was thinking about things that happened to me as a young person. So I grew up in a mining town at a time where there was a particular, there was a miners' strike, which was a big national event, politically very diverse, sort of a lot of conflict, very controversial. And it really had an effect on how I saw the world. And I think sitting down and writing your media biographies, if you're a media student, sit down and think about what are the times in your life where you really think media affected what happened to you. So, if you're a young person from Novi Bazar and you've come to Belgrade, have you been treated in a particular way because of the way you dress or the way you sound or because of things that people think about where you're from? And then I think so I address this to the young people in the room, but also to the media scholars in the room who are interested in teaching about media literacy. Kind of start off from not the media experiences that you think are important, but from the media experiences that young people have, and get them to write accounts of how media have had an effect on their lives that they can really talk about, in a way that they can own this idea about media influence. Because I think the problem quite often with notions of media literacy is that it's kind of a discussion that goes above the heads of young people. But those are kind of my conclusions about media literacy, and those are the general themes that I approach in the book. And thank you for listening so politely. Thank you.